The morning I saw it happen, I almost missed it entirely. I was standing maybe 30 feet from the gate, eating a slightly stale croissant I'd bought from a cart near St. James's Park, and honestly, my mind was somewhere else. I was thinking about whether I'd left my hotel key on the bedside table, and whether the gray sky was going to properly rain on us, or just threaten to all day. That kind of ordinary morning fog that sits in your head when you're on holiday and nothing quite fits together yet. And then something made me look up. I don't know what it was, maybe a shift in the crowd, maybe just instinct, but I looked up and I saw him. Let me back up a little because the setting matters here. You need to see this the way I saw it, standing there with crumbs on my coat. Buckingham Palace in early November is a different animal from Buckingham Palace in July. In July, it's shoulder-to-shoulder tourists, selfie sticks everywhere, children on shoulders, tour guides with flags, the whole spectacle. It's alive in a loud, performative way. But in November, especially on a cold Tuesday morning, it settles into something quieter and more dignified. There are still tourists, there are always tourists, but they're fewer and they move slower, and they seem to actually look at the place rather than just photograph it and leave. The trees lining the mall had turned gold and red, and some of the leaves were coming down. Not dramatically, not the way leaves fall in films, but in that slightly untidy, drifting way they actually fall, one here, one there, spinning sideways before landing on the pavement with no ceremony at all. The sky was that particular London gray that isn't quite threatening and isn't quite clear, like the city can't make up its mind. There were maybe 60, 70 people gathered along the iron fence, the way people always gather. Cameras ready, some of them patient, some of them slightly bored. A few children pressed against the railings. A Japanese couple in matching coats consulting a paper map, which I found oddly charming. Two teenage boys sitting on the low wall eating crisps and scrolling their phones, clearly dragged here by parents and making the most of it. The forecourt stretched out behind the gates, clean and wide, the gravel pale in the flat morning light. And there, as always, was the guard. He was posted at the northern sentry box, the one closest to the gate, maybe 20 meters inside the fence. Tall man. Couldn't tell his age from where I was standing, but there was something in the way he carried himself that told you he wasn't a nervous recruit. The bearskin hat, the red tunic, the black trousers with the red stripe, all of it immaculate, not a crease out of place. His boots caught what little light there was and gave it back polished. He was marching. That's the thing people don't always realize before they see it. They expect the guards to just stand there, statues with heartbeats, but they march. Back and forth along their beat, this precise, unhurried rhythm. 15 paces one way, sharp turn, 15 paces back. The rifle at the shoulder, the arms swinging in perfect counterpoint. The boot coming down with that definite, deliberate sound on the gravel that you can hear even through the fence if it's not too noisy. I'd been watching him for a minute or two, maybe less. Just the way you watch, not really absorbing anything, just registering. And then she came into my peripheral vision from the left. I noticed her because she was moving against the general flow of the crowd, which itself wasn't much of a flow, more of a cluster, a pooling of bodies near the fence. But she was coming through it from the far end, moving parallel to the gate rather than standing and watching like everyone else. Elderly, that's the first word. Genuinely elderly, not just older, the kind of elderly where the years are visible in the architecture of movement, in the small, careful way each foot found the ground before the next step. She was maybe 5 feet tall, possibly less. A blue wool coat, the kind of double-breasted style that was fashionable 50 years ago and somehow on her still looked right. A cream-colored scarf. White hair set in the kind of short, neat wave that takes a certain kind of woman to maintain even into her 80s. She had a handbag over one arm, dark navy, slightly worn at the clasp, and she was using a walking stick in her other hand. Not one of those aluminum NHS-style ones. A proper wooden one, curved handle, the kind that suggests it's been in use for many years and has earned its place. She was trying to get somewhere. That was clear from the purposefulness of her movement, the way she was navigating the edge of the tourist crowd with small adjustments of her body angling sideways, past a large man with a camera tripod, edging around a young couple who hadn't quite noticed her coming. I didn't know where she was going. Maybe she lived nearby. Maybe she was just trying to get through the crowd to the other side. But something about her, the slight breathlessness I noticed as she drew closer, the way she paused for just a second near the fence to get her bearings, made me pay attention. And then her walking stick caught on something. A crack in the pavement, maybe, or a slightly raised edge I couldn't see from where I stood. Whatever it was, for one awful, suspended second she lurched forward, not falling, not quite, but tipping, catching herself with the stick on her other side. But the catch was hard and sudden, and her handbag swung out from her elbow, and the contents, a purse, a folded piece of paper, what looked like a small packet of tissues, scattered across the pavement and skittered toward the base of the iron fence. She steadied herself. The whole thing lasted maybe 2 seconds. Most people didn't see it. The couple nearby were already looking the other way. The man with the tripod was absorbed in his camera settings. I took a step forward, instinctively. But I was too far, and then I stopped because someone else had already reacted. The guard had seen it. That was the thing I couldn't quite process at first. He was inside the fence, 15 meters away on the other side of iron railings, in the middle of his marching beat. His face was supposed to be forward, his focus contained within the boundaries of his post. But he had seen it. He'd been on his return pass, moving away from the gate when she'd stumbled, and I saw him stop. Not a full stop, not immediate, more like a hesitation built into a halt. One more step, and then his boot came down and didn't lift again. His body didn't swing into the next motion. He simply stopped in the middle of his beat and turned his head, not dramatically, not with any sudden movement, but turned it just slightly toward where she was standing. A murmur moved through the people nearest to me. Not words, just that collective shift of attention that happens when something changes in a situation everyone's been watching. A few cameras lowered slightly. A few faces turned. The guard stood completely still for a moment, maybe 3 seconds, 4, and I watched him assess something. His eyes were on her. She was collecting herself now, one hand on the fence, bending slowly and with obvious effort toward the scattered items on the pavement. And you could see the difficulty in it, the stiff back, the stick in one hand, the way she couldn't quite reach without making the whole thing precarious again. And here is where I need to try to describe something that is very difficult to describe, which is watching a person make a decision in real time. Because what happened next wasn't automatic. It wasn't a reflex. I have thought about this moment many times in the months since it happened, and I'm convinced that what I saw in those few seconds was a man weighing something, his duty against something else. Some older instruction that lives below training, below protocol in some quieter place. He turned fully toward the gate. Still inside the fence, but facing it now. He took a single step forward, then another. I heard someone near me say something, I think it was in German, a soft exclamation, and then the crowd near that section of fence shifted and sort of opened, the way crowds do when they sense something is about to happen. The guard reached the inner side of the gate, not the ceremonial gate itself, but a smaller access point to the left of the main structure, a gap in the fence used by staff. He was perhaps 5 feet from where she was standing on the other side. He leaned, slightly, very precisely, and through the gap or between the bars, I couldn't tell exactly from my angle, he spoke to her. I couldn't hear what he said. I was too far away, and there was still the ambient noise of the street behind us, a bus going past, someone's child asking a question, the general texture of a London morning. But I saw her look up, startled, and then, a moment later, her face changed. He had spoken to her. A royal guard on duty in full ceremonial kit had stepped toward her and spoken to her through the fence. She looked at him, then she looked at the things on the ground, then she looked back at him, and she nodded slowly the way you nod when someone has offered you something and you've decided to accept. The guard called out, not to her but sideways, toward someone else. I followed his eyeline and saw a colleague, another guard stationed further back in the forecourt, whose position gave him a slightly different angle. A few words passed between them. I saw the second guard nod, and then the first guard moved to the access point. He opened it. He stepped through. And there was a sound from the people around me then that I've never quite forgotten. It wasn't applause, not yet. It was something quieter than that. It was the sound of 60 people all inhaling at slightly the same time. He was outside the fence now. The royal guard was outside his post, standing on the public pavement in his full ceremonial uniform in November, in the ordinary open air of a Tuesday morning. He was taller than he'd seemed from a distance. The bearskin added height, but it wasn't just that. He was naturally a tall man, broad-shouldered, and standing beside this small woman in her blue coat, he looked almost architecturally different from her. like two things from entirely different scales of the world, suddenly placed next to each other. He crouched down. Not elegantly, not the way it would happen in a film. He was in ceremonial trousers and carrying a rifle and wearing a hat that weighs close to a kilogram, and crouching in all of that is not a graceful operation. But he did it carefully, and he gathered the items from the pavement. The purse, the folded paper, the tissues. A small thing I hadn't seen from my angle. A little laminated card, maybe a bus pass or an Oyster card, that had slid further toward the base of the fence. He found them all. He stood back up slowly, and he held them out to her. She took them with both hands. She transferred her stick to the crook of her elbow to free her hands, and she looked down at them and then up at him. And she said something. Her lips moved, and from the way they moved, and from the expression on her face, I am almost certain it was thank you. But there was something else, because she kept looking at him, and he kept standing there, and she said something more. He was facing her directly now, and I was far enough away, and the angle was wrong for me to read his expression clearly. But he didn't move. He was listening to her. This is the part that got me, I think. More than the stepping outside, more than picking up her things. It was the standing there afterward, listening. Because here's what most people don't understand about royal guards, what the tourists don't understand, what the people who yell into their faces to try to make them react don't understand. Their composure isn't blankness. It isn't absence of self. It's a kind of controlled presence, a discipline of attention that actually requires more engagement with the world, not less. You have to be aware of everything around you to remain that still. And here he was, that same composure applied to something entirely different. He was giving her his full attention, not hurried, not performing patience. Just present, the way you are present with someone who is telling you something that deserves to be heard. Whatever she was saying, and I will tell you what I later found out she was saying because the story has an afterward, it took perhaps 45 seconds, maybe a minute, and he stood and he listened, and somewhere in there he said something back to her, and she nodded, and then she smiled. I want to try to describe that smile, because it was the thing that broke the composure of everyone watching. It was an old woman's smile. That sounds simple, but it isn't. There's a particular quality to how some elderly people smile, especially those who have lived long enough to know that kindness is not as common as it should be, and who have therefore developed a way of registering it when it appears that goes beyond the social courtesy of a polite grin. It's slower. It reaches the eyes in a way that takes a moment to arrive, like it travels up from somewhere deep. It changes the whole face. She smiled at him like that. And then, because apparently she was a woman who felt things fully and didn't see much point in hiding it, her hand came up and she touched his arm, very briefly, just a moment of contact, her small hand on the red sleeve of his tunic, and he didn't pull away. Someone near me started crying. I heard it, a soft, involuntary sound, the kind that escapes before you've decided to let it. I didn't look to see who it was. I didn't want to look away. He helped her find her footing again, not grabbing her arm, not being presumptuous about it, but standing close enough that she could feel the steadiness of his presence beside her while she resettled her stick and her bag. He said something else. She replied. And then, with one more look at him, direct, grateful, complete, she resumed her walk. She moved away along the fence, unhurried, the blue coat disappearing gradually into the thin crowd further down the pavement. She didn't look back, and somehow that was right. The encounter had been what it was, and she carried it with her, and that was enough. The guard watched her for a moment, 3 seconds, 4, and then he turned back to the access point and stepped back through, and the gate closed behind him with a precise metallic click. And then the applause started. It began with the Japanese couple. I noticed because they started it before most people had even registered that it was over. They started clapping with a kind of enthusiastic immediacy that suggested they had been waiting for the right moment and had found it. And then it spread. The family with the children, the solo tourists, me. Even the teenage boys on the wall had put down their phones, and one of them started clapping with the kind of self-conscious slowness that 16-year-old boys use when they're feeling something but don't want anyone to know. The guard had resumed his marching beat by the time the applause fully rose. 15 paces this way, sharp turn, 15 paces back. The rifle at the shoulder, the arm swinging, the boots on the gravel, perfectly composed, perfectly unchanged. Except that on his second pass, when he was facing toward the crowd, I thought, I'm not certain, and I'm not going to claim certainty, but I thought I saw, at the very corner of his mouth, the slightest motion. So brief it might have been imagination. So small it would have been invisible from anywhere but where I was standing. Something that, on any other face, you would call a smile. I didn't plan to speak to her. That's the honest truth. After the applause died down and people gradually dispersed back into their own days, cameras going back into bags, children being redirected toward the gift shop or the park, the whole quiet disbanding of an accidental audience, I stayed for a few minutes, leaning against the low wall, thinking about what I'd just seen. Turning it over in my mind the way you do when something small has landed on you harder than it had any right to. I was thinking about heading toward the park when I saw her again. She was about 20 meters away, standing at the corner where the palace fence meets the turn toward Birdcage Walk. She'd stopped, not because of her hip or her stick, it seemed, but with intention. She was looking back toward the gate, toward the forecourt. At the guard, who was still marching, still immaculate, still contained within his measured beat. I don't know what came over me. Nosiness, maybe, or something less embarrassing than that, a genuine wish to understand what had just happened fully from a perspective I didn't have. Whatever it was, I walked over. I approached carefully, the way you approach someone who looks like they're in the middle of a private moment. I stopped a couple of feet away and said, mildly, "Were you all right? I saw what happened by the fence." She looked at me. Her eyes were pale blue, very clear. She considered me for a moment in the way that older people sometimes do, not rude, but honest, like they've earned the right to take a proper look before deciding whether you're worth their time. Then she said, "I was perfectly all right, bit clumsy, that's all." A pause. He was very kind. Her accent was English. Home counties, I thought, not London exactly, somewhere south of it. There was a particular precision to her consonants that spoke of a certain generation and a certain kind of upbringing. He was, I agreed. I'd never seen a guard do that. She looked back toward the gate again, thoughtful. "No," she said, "I don't suppose many people have." I asked if she'd mind if I walked with her a little way. I was heading toward the park, I said, which was only half a fabrication, and she said mildly that she didn't mind. So we fell into step slowly, along the fence line, and she told me about herself in the unhurried, slightly meandering way that people of a certain age tell you things, not because they're disorganized in their thoughts, but because they understand that the path to a point is part of the point. Her name was Margaret. She was 81. She'd lived in London most of her life, with a gap of 8 years in Edinburgh when her late husband had worked there. She came to this stretch of the palace at least once a week, she said, had done for years. It was part of her routine, not sightseeing, not at this point in her life. Just walking, just being here. "My husband used to say I was married to London," she said, not bitterly. Fondly, the way you speak about someone when the grief has had time to settle into something that aches softly rather than sharply. He meant it as a compliment, I think. I asked her how long ago she'd lost him. 4 years, she said. In March, a pause. The crocuses were out, which I still think was slightly unfair. I didn't say anything to that. It didn't need a response. She told me as we walked what she'd said to the guard. The thing she'd said after thank you, the 45 seconds I'd watched without being able to hear. She'd told him, and she said this with a certain matter-of-factness, as if it was the most natural thing in the world to tell a ceremonial soldier outside a royal palace, that he reminded her of someone. Her son, he was 47 now, her son. Lived in Bristol with his family, came to see her once a month, rang her most Sundays. But she had a photograph on her mantelpiece of him in his mid-20s, in the uniform of the British Army. He'd served 8 years, she said, left as a corporal, and something about the way this guard stood, the way he held himself, had struck her from the moment she'd first noticed him through the fence. "It's the straightness," she said, and she made a motion with her hand, not quite gesturing, more like touching an idea. "Not the stiffness, that's different, the straightness. Robert had it too, still does actually, even now that he's gained a bit around the middle." A small, private smile. "You can train it into people, but you can't train out of them. It either takes or it doesn't." So when she'd stumbled and the guard had come to her and she'd taken a proper look at him up close, the young face under the formal hat, the serious eyes, the careful way he handed her things, she'd had one of those moments, she said, where the world briefly superimposes itself, where the present contains the past. She'd told him he reminded her of her son. She'd apologized immediately after, in case it seemed an odd thing to say. And he, still outside his post, still on the public pavement, still technically in breach of who knows what military expectation, had said, without any awkwardness at all, "I hope that's a good thing, ma'am." And she had laughed. She told me this, and she laughed again now. A small, genuine laugh, the kind that carries the original moment inside it like a note kept in a pocket. He had good manners, she said, proper ones, not the forced kind. We had reached the entrance to St. James's Park by now. The path ran down through it toward the lake, where a few ducks were conducting their affairs with the customary sense of self-importance that London ducks have developed over centuries of tourist attention. Margaret stopped at the gate. "This is where I usually sit for a bit," she said, gesturing toward a bench just inside the park, facing the lake, with a view back up through the trees toward the general direction of the palace. "I have a flask." She tapped the side of her bag. "Earl Grey. My daughter thinks it's eccentric to carry tea everywhere. I think it's practical." I said it seemed very practical to me. She looked at me, and then at the bench, and then back at me with the clear-eyed, unsentimental consideration of someone who has been alive long enough to know the difference between company worth having and company worth politely declining. "You can sit if you like," she said. "I'm not very interesting, but I've been told I'm a good listener." I sat. We talked for nearly an hour in the end. I won't set down all of it here, some of it was hers, and I'll leave it with her. But I want to set down the part that has stayed with me most, which came about 20 minutes in, when I asked her something that I'd been wondering since I saw the guard crouch down to retrieve her things. I asked her what she thought he'd risked by coming out, whether she thought he'd get in trouble. She considered the question seriously, which I appreciated. She didn't dismiss it. "I thought about that," she said. "While he was standing there, I almost told him to go back. I nearly said, 'No, don't, it's not worth it, I'm fine.'" She looked out at the lake. A duck had found something interesting near the bank and was investigating it with great commitment. "But then I thought, he's a man, isn't he? A grown man who's made a choice. It would have been rather condescending to second-guess it." I said I thought that was a generous interpretation. "I'm 81, she said mildly. "I've run out of time for ungenerous interpretations." A beat of silence, the park sounds filling it. Wind in bare branches, distant voices. A child somewhere yelling with enthusiasm about the ducks. Then she said something that I've turned over in my mind many times since, trying to make sure I remember it right. She said, "The thing about soldiers, the good ones, the ones who become good at it, is that they understand the difference between a rule and a reason. The rule exists because of the reason. Most of the time, the rule is enough. But occasionally, the reason is so obvious that you'd be a fool to hide behind the rule." She said it simply, not philosophically, like she was stating something she'd observed, not something she'd theorized. I asked her where that came from. "Robert," she said, "my son, he told me that years ago, after." She paused just briefly after something that happened when he was serving. He wouldn't give me the details, but that's what he said. She finished her tea. She poured a second cup from the flask, holding it out to offer me some. I declined, thanking her, and she wrapped both hands around the plastic mug and looked across the park. Before I left, I asked if I could take a photograph. Not of her, I clarified quickly, but of the bench. This bench, this spot. I wanted something to place the story in, to give it a location I could return to in my mind. She said I could. Then she said, unprompted, "I'll come back next Tuesday, I always do." A pause. "I wonder if he'll be there." I said I hoped he would. She turned and looked at me, and there was something very direct in her eyes, something that had been there the whole time but that she'd kept mostly contained, and I thought, she has been carrying this quietly for the last hour. This small brightness. "You know what the funny thing is?" she said. "He never stopped being on duty, not for a second. The whole thing, stepping out, picking up my things, listening to me rabbit on about Robert, he was still on duty the whole time. He just expanded what it meant." She turned back to the lake. "That seemed right to me," she said. "That seemed exactly right." I walked back through the park alone afterward, through the falling November leaves and the thin gray light, past the couple with the matching coats who'd found a new map from somewhere, past the boys on the wall who had, apparently, finally taken a single photograph of the palace at their father's persistent request, and were now visibly relieved to be done with it. I passed the guard's sentry box on my way out. He was marching again, or still maybe, for all I knew. The same rhythm, the same clean 15 paces. A new crowd had gathered, slightly different faces, but the same shape of attention. Cameras and curiosity, and the general human instinct to look at something that represents order and tradition and control, something that holds its line in a world that rarely does. I stopped for a moment. He passed on his beat, facing forward, arms swinging, boots precise on the gravel. He looked as he always looked, immovable, perfect, present. And I thought about what Margaret had said, about the rule and the reason, about a man who had understood that the point of standing firm is not the standing itself, but what the standing is for, and that sometimes what the standing is for includes a woman in a blue coat who needs someone to pick up her bus, pass from the pavement, and stay for a moment without hurrying off. 3 weeks after it happened, I found out his name. I wasn't looking for it exactly, but I'd told the story to a friend who writes for a small publication, nothing major, a cultural magazine, and she'd done what journalists do, which is follow the thread until it either ties off or opens into something bigger. She rang me on a Wednesday evening. "His name is Thomas," she said without preamble. "That's all I'm going to give you because that's all he'd allow. He spoke to them, the regiment agreed to let him speak to them, but just for a few minutes and no surname, no photograph." I asked her what he'd said. She told me. He'd said he didn't think of it as an especially remarkable thing. That was the first thing. He'd said this, apparently, with perfect composure, in the same tone you'd use to describe having held a door open for someone or offered directions to a lost tourist. He didn't understand, he said, why people were making much of it. The online video, because someone had filmed it, of course someone had filmed it. This is the world we live in now, had collected something in the millions of views by the time anyone thought to ask him about it, and he found this genuinely puzzling. She needed help, he apparently said. I was the closest person to her, it seemed obvious. My friend, who has interviewed politicians and decorated athletes, and various people who have had cameras trained on them all their lives, said that what struck her was that there was nothing performative about it. No false modesty, no practiced humility, just a man who had done something and could not locate in himself any surplus meaning attached to the doing of it. She said she'd asked him, wasn't he worried about protocol, about stepping outside his post? And he'd said, and this is the part I keep returning to, the part that seems to me to contain something essential, he'd said, I informed my colleague of my intention before I moved. That's procedure. If I see a civilian at risk, I address it within available means. I then return to post. A pause, apparently, and then, I don't think the uniform means you stop noticing people. That last sentence. I keep turning it over. I don't think the uniform means you stop noticing people. There's a kind of person who wears a role, any role, not just a military one, and allows the role to do their seeing for them. The uniform tells you what to look at and what to disregard. The protocol defines the edges of your attention. You become, in a sense, the function rather than the person, and the function has a very specific field of vision. And then there are the ones who wear the role without losing the eyes underneath it, who keep the original seeing intact, the human, unfiltered, prior to training attention that notices a woman in a blue coat struggling with a walking stick and a scattered handbag and a back that doesn't bend well anymore, and registers it the way you register it, not as a protocol category, but as a person having a difficult moment. Thomas had that. Whatever it is, whatever produces it in a person, whether it's upbringing or experience or something you're simply born with, he had it. He kept the eyes underneath. The video, when I finally watched it, my friend sent me the link, and I sat in my hotel room the night before I flew home and watched it on my laptop, was strange to see. Strange because I'd been there. I'd watched it from 30 feet away, live in the cold November air. And the video, which had been taken by one of the tourists I'd barely registered, a woman with a phone who'd been standing much closer to the action than I was both more and less than the experience. More because it showed me things I hadn't been able to see from my angle. It showed his face when he was speaking to Margaret through the fence, the calm, complete attention of it, the absence of any self-consciousness about the slight awkwardness of his position. It showed her face when she first looked up at him, that flicker of surprise and then relief. It showed the exact moment his hand appeared between the bars and extended toward the scattered items on the ground, careful, unhurried, like he had all the time available to him and not merely borrowed minutes. And it showed the moment I've described, her touching his sleeve, and from this angle, from closer, I could see what I had not been able to see from where I stood. That when she did it, when that small hand came to rest briefly on the red fabric of his tunic, he very slightly and very deliberately inclined his head. Not a bow, not anything theatrical, just a dip of the chin, slow and intentional, the way you acknowledge something that matters. That was more. What was less was the sound. The ambient noise of the video, phone, wind, traffic, the irregular sounds of bystanders flattened the morning into something slightly distant. The cold wasn't in it. The smell of London in November, that particular mix of damp leaves and diesel and the faint sweetness from the food cart, wasn't in it. The way my breath had been just barely visible in the air wasn't in it. Those things were mine, and the video didn't have them, and they're part of why the experience is still clearer to me than any filmed version of it could be. But I'm glad the video exists. I'm glad it exists because of what happened after it spread. In the days and weeks following, letters arrived at the palace. Not emails, letters, physical letters, because this is apparently what happens when something touches people who are of a certain age. A woman in Dorset wrote to say she had cried for 20 minutes and then rung her son, whom she had not spoken to in 8 months following a dispute about something she now described as trivial. A retired soldier in Yorkshire wrote a 3-page letter about what it meant to serve, and what he'd watched himself forget about it over the years, and what the video had returned to him. A schoolteacher in Dublin used the moment as the basis for a lesson on something she called professional kindness, the idea that your role and your humanity are not in opposition. I heard about some of these through my friend, who had begun following the story properly by now. And I thought about what Margaret had said on the bench, about the rule and the reason. And it seemed to me that what people were responding to was something they recognized and had perhaps, in the ordinary grind of daily life, temporarily misplaced. The idea that duty and decency can coexist, not just coexist, can be the same thing, the same motion, expressed with the same hands. I went back on my last morning in London. I'd extended my stay by a day, not originally because of this. I'd had practical reasons. But I found myself, on that last morning, pulling on my coat and heading back to the palace before I quite knew I'd decided to. It was a different kind of morning from the first one, colder, clearer. The gray had broken overnight, and there was actual pale winter sunlight coming in low over the tree line, the kind of light that doesn't warm you but that shows you everything with unusual precision. The leaves on the mall had mostly come down now, and they lay in drifts along the edges of the path. The sky was that thin, washed-out blue that you sometimes get in London in late November, when the cloud cover lifts and you realize the sky was there the whole time. I walked down to the palace and stood at the same stretch of fence. There were fewer people today. A weekday early, perhaps 8:30 in the morning, a handful of determined tourists. A man walking a dog who had clearly come this way by habit rather than design. The dog navigating the pavement with the efficient focus of an animal who knows the route and wants to get on with it. The guard today was different. Shorter man, lighter build, younger-looking face under the bearskin. He was marching his beat with the same precision, 15 paces, turn, 15 paces back, but there was something in him that read as newer, as less fully settled into the role. Not worse, just earlier in the becoming. I watched him for a while. I thought about Thomas, wherever he was posted today, whatever his beat, whatever Tuesday had brought him. I thought about him saying, "I don't think the uniform means you stop noticing people," and how simple it sounded and how much it contained. I thought about Margaret on her bench with her Earl Grey looking out at the lake, whether she'd slept well, whether she'd rung her son Robert and told him the story, whether he'd recognized something of himself in the telling. There's a thing I've thought about, in the months since this happened, which is the question of whether any of it is as significant as it felt. A guard stepped out of his post for 90 seconds and helped an old woman retrieve her dropped things and listened to her talk about her son. In the scale of what happens in the world on any given Tuesday, the grief, the cruelty, the large and small violence of ordinary life, it is, objectively, a small thing, a tiny thing. A thing that took less than 2 minutes and cost nothing except a departure from protocol and a private conversation through iron bars. And yet, there is a reason the video spread to millions of people. There is a reason the letters arrived. There is a reason I stayed an extra day in London and went back to the fence and stood there in the thin winter light, turning the whole thing over in my mind again. The reason, I think, is that we are deeply hungry for it. Not for spectacle, Not for heroism in the dramatic sense, but for the small evidence that people are still capable of seeing each other, of pausing whatever they're supposed to be doing and simply registering the person in front of them and responding to what they find there. In a world where everyone is hurrying, where everything is mediated by screens, where the roles we perform have grown thicker and harder and more difficult to see through. In that world, a soldier in a bearskin hat who sees an old woman stumble and does not look away is unexpectedly revolutionary. He didn't save anyone. He didn't prevent a tragedy. He picked up a bus pass and a purse and a packet of tissues and stood still for 45 seconds and listened. And somehow the whole world leaned in. On my way out of the palace grounds that last morning, I passed the food cart where I'd bought the croissant 3 weeks earlier. Different person behind it. Older man, thick coat, breath making small clouds in the cold air. I bought a coffee because I needed it and a slightly stale croissant because it felt right. I stood there and ate it, looking back toward the gate. The young guard was still marching. Back and forth, the gravel under his boots, the thin sunlight catching the brass on his uniform. He didn't know me. He didn't know any of us watching him. He was just doing the thing he'd been trained to do in the way he'd been trained to do it. And I thought, somewhere inside that, if he's lucky, if he's the right kind of person, somewhere inside all that training and protocol and discipline, there's still a pair of eyes that look out and see the world clearly. That notice the woman in the blue coat. That register the stumble. That make the decision. You can't force it. You can't train it in, not really. It's either there or it isn't. But when it's there, when you see it, there is no adequate response except to feel, in the most unglamorous and honest way, a kind of quiet gratitude that the world still contains people like that. People who understand that the point of the uniform is not the uniform. People who have never forgotten how to notice. I fly home tomorrow. Or, I flew home, rather. This was months ago now. I'm writing it from memory, from notes I made on my phone on the walk back to the hotel that last morning, from the particular clarity that sometimes comes with distance. Margaret will be in the park today, I'd imagine. It's Tuesday. Thomas will be on his post somewhere, marching his beat. 14 paces this way and 15 paces back, the bearskin level, the rifle correct, the boots certain on the ground. And somewhere in Britain, a woman's son doesn't know yet that a stranger saw something in a guard outside Buckingham Palace and thought of him. Doesn't know his mother sat in a cold November park and talked about straightness of posture and the quality of a man's attention and a photograph on the mantelpiece. Doesn't know how much she loves him. Though I suspect, when she got home that Tuesday, she might have rung him and found a way to say something close to it. Some days are like that. They arrange themselves, without your asking, into a shape that lets you say the thing you've been meaning to say. And sometimes it takes a guard in a bearskin hat, stepping outside the lines of his duty and into the larger duty underneath it, to show you the door. He never broke his composure. He never raised his voice. He simply saw her, and sometimes that is the whole of it. Sometimes that is everything.